You're listening to WPPM LP in Philadelphia. Stay tuned for the People Power Lunch Hour Show. Up next on PhillyCam. Good afternoon. You're listening to WPPM in Philadelphia and also watching on PhillyCam TV. This is the People Power Lunch Hour Show, and I'm your host, Vanessa Maria Graber. On today's show, I am going to be talking with 3 law students from area universities who are using law as a path towards social justice. We'll talk about some of their legal work and some of the issues here locally in Philadelphia that they are studying and working on, and lots more. Stay tuned for this edition of the People Power Lunch Hour Show. Welcome back to the People Power Lunch Hour Show. I'm your host, Vanessa Maria Graber, and on today's show, we are going to be talking with students from law schools here in Philadelphia. I am joined in the studio by Shaban Harding and Waqar Rahmat, who is from Villanova Law School, and also Cassie Grange, who's from Drexel University Law School. And they're all students here who are also interested in social justice organizing, social movements, and, using that as a path towards social justice. And as you know, on this show, there are people working on many different issues, and law is one that's really, really important. Lawyers spend a lot of time as unsung heroes in the courtrooms, defending the rights of protesters, suing the federal government and other organizations that have committed unjust, things, and also helping the innocent get out of jail. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce my guests again, Catherine, Shaban, and Waqar. I'll start with you, Waqar, since I spoke with you first. What made you interested in law, and how did you decide to pursue this as a career path?
Okay. Firstly, thank you for having me on, and it's an honor to be here, and thank you to my co-panelists here. It's an honor to be speaking with both of you and learning about some of the things that you do as well. So I am actually a very, very non-traditional law student. I'm actually 34 years old, so I spent some time in the working world before starting law school. And I guess what prompted me to consider the law as a means through which social change can be achieved is when I started as an undergrad at Temple University way back when in 2001. This was fall of 2001, just a week or two after the semester began, the tragedy of 9/11 happened. I am an American Muslim. I come from a Muslim family. My parents immigrated here from Pakistan. And, 2 weeks after college started, this tragedy happens, and immediately Muslims in America have become the focus of media, commentariat, politicians. So whether we wanted to or not, we were just sort of thrust into the public eye. The civil liberties and civil rights of Muslims in America were compromised and were violated numerous times for many years after the 9/11 attacks. And I just always wanted to work in a career where I would be able to be an advocate not only for Muslims but for other marginalized communities whose civil liberties and civil rights are violated. So I spent a lot of time during undergrad working with the Temple University Muslim Students Association, as well as other organizations who were also advocating for social change. I wasn't immediately thinking of law school at the time, so I spent about 7 or 8 years afterwards in the working world, and finally realized that I wanted to pursue my passions some more, and that's when I applied to law school, and that's how I ended up where I am right now.
Thanks for telling that story. Shaban, we'll go to you next. What inspired you to decide to go to law school?
So I can't exactly follow up Waqar. I don't really think so. Thanks, buddy. But essentially, I always wanted to go to law school. I just remember being 10 one day and going, you know what? I think I want to help people, and I could help people by being a lawyer. And I'm not quite certain how that connected in my little 10-year-old brain at that point, but essentially it was something that I always wanted to do. As I went to college at Westchester University, and I studied political science, international relations. And that was where I was able to first kind of get the idea, just globally, what sort of injustices happen, especially in terms of the United States and our very complicated and very rich history, essentially. So going into law school, I ended up taking about a gap year of about a year and a half. So I was in the working world for like a slight minute. I went in and realized that, I could be doing things as potentially maybe a prosecutor starting out. Now, this is happening in 2014, 2015, when I'm, Krasner's not on the news yet. So the idea of having like a prosecutor who could be like progressive and being like, well, maybe we can prevent things from happening or prevent these people from going into what is now this huge system of incarceration that we have. And I may be one cog in the wheel, but that's the beginning, right? So that's really what started me on that path to really think about how I can be using what privileges I have been afforded and what education that I have been given in order to further help those people who can't really get that access otherwise, really.
Thank you. Cassie, we'll go to you next. What made you decide to go into law?
So I think that I've always had like a justice bone in my body. So from like the littlest things that maybe my sibling gets punished for something that I just don't want them to get punished for, or whatever it is, that when anything is unfair, I always felt I needed to be an advocate for them, and I didn't do a good job all the time. But I think that's what led me to think about going into legal career. And then I can remember in my sophomore year of college learning about what the term white privilege meant. And I think that speaks to my white privilege, that it was my sophomore year of college learning about that term and how it affected me. And so then I just like kind of dove into a study of our history in America and understanding how, slavery was in the past, but there's still so many manifestations of slavery and Jim Crow that manifest itself in our current system of mass incarceration. And so having that justice bone, I'm just like, this is unfair, and I want to do something to affect change. But so race issues are, I think, what led me into wanting to become a lawyer and going to law school. I think our criminal justice system is stacked against poor people and people of color, and that bothers me. And so I want to do something about it. So
that's great. You all have that same, desire to want to help people and take action, and that's what people power is all about. So tell me about some of your concerns, since the election of Donald Trump. There's been a lot of legal battles, both locally and nationally speaking. And we've seen a lot of public reaction of people organizing, whether it's having town halls or being out in the streets or people going on strike and organizing boycotts. There have been many people on the front lines, especially here in Philly, reacting to things that involved our civil liberties. Waqar, I'll let you go first.
Sure. So it's interesting because we're seeing a mobilization and organizing of the people that is unlike anything I've ever seen in my lifetime. Not to say that, such organizing has never happened in the past before, but at the same time, we're also seeing erosion of civil liberties. We are seeing the attempts to criminalize First Amendment activities, our First Amendment right to protest. So I think that's another civil liberties battleground that lawyers and other social justice activists are going to have to address. And there's another concern that I have of the influence that Trump and his rhetoric has. I think sometimes there's a mistake that activists are making in thinking that as long as we can get Trump out of office, then everything will be solved. But that sort of takes away from the emboldening of certain people who Trump has emboldened in the wake of his election. And I think that it will require a lot of education and communication to try to get rid of some of the ignorant racist views that are so prevalent in our society.
Yeah, indeed. What about you, Cassie and Shaban? What are your concerns? I mean, especially after, 2017, a tumultuous year, a lot of activity. You're in law school seeing all of this unfold. What are you guys thinking?
So I know for me, a dirty little secret, which I don't think many activists talk about, and we need to be talking about it, so then when we speak it into existence, we have to acknowledge it, is that these views have always existed, right? So, like, this has been something that's always been lying in, the fabric of many people's minds, and then with the emboldening that came from Trump, it's this whole tell it like it is rhetoric, where it's like, oh, well, I have the ability to tell it like it is, so this is what I think. So I think that was something that I found very interesting, because what I find is that this whole tell it like it is sort of movement is only really one-sided, right? Like, there's nothing really that I could be punished for, because I'm living comfortably with my own privileges that I have, saying, well, I think two people should have, regardless of what your gender is, you should be able to get married or to have marriage equality or to not be fired. But to espouse some sort of like racist, sexist, whatever-ist statement you can say without the idea of being punished for it or facing some sort of repercussion. And then to go off of that, people going, oh, well, that's a protection of my First Amendment, like my free speech, which if you've taken con law, you realize it's a lot more difficult than that. So I know what I see, which I think is very interesting, is that we're seeing a sort of like, I don't want to say a weaponization of words, but the way that Donald Trump can just type something on a keyboard and just submit it into the world and having it have vast consequences. And we've seen it now with him, whether it be talking about, the trans ban in the military, whether it be talking about whenever his court cases ultimately lose, or talking about, I think, what was it most recently? It was the abortion case with the undocumented teenagers. But then
The
in
Jane
doing
Does.
so, right. But in doing so, it's also sort of giving voice and giving a space for those people who are being targeted. So those undocumented teens who are being targeted by the government, who, you know, otherwise they wouldn't have a voice. So it's just, to me, I think it's concerning. And it's concerning because at the end of the day, these are people who are getting specifically affected. And now with the emboldening, it can really be a physical danger for people.
Cassie, are you concerned as well?
Yeah, so I don't think I have very much perspective on this topic and on this presidency. I'm just kind of like, I'm just experiencing everything. I'm 25, and so I don't know that I haven't always been super involved in politics. But on a positive note, and to kind of go off of what you just said, I think that while certain people are coming out of the woodwork with some of their racist and sexist and whatever belief systems, while they're able to speak and being emboldened about saying those negative things and those hateful things, I think also we're in a time where you take an issue like policing and we're talking about it. And I think that a lot of times that is where social change starts. Like if you look at our history with domestic violence or with DUIs, they've always been wrong. It's always been wrong to beat your wife, but we didn't actually prosecute people who beat their wives until recently. And so it's because as a society, we decided that we don't want to accept that behavior anymore. And so we're gonna do something about it. And I think that while people with negative points of views and hate have been emboldened to speak up, a lot of us here, like people like who are on this radio show, have also been emboldened to say, you're wrong, and we're going to start talking about it. We're going to have a conversation about policing and about how we treat juveniles in our criminal justice system, or how we treat poor people in our cities, or what have you, that we're talking about it, and that's a good step. That's like the first step in order to make change. So I've been encouraged by that, if nothing else.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, I think a lot of people, as Walker mentioned, have seen a lot of normal people who, and maybe normal is not just, regular everyday people who aren't involved in activism, who are apolitical, who don't have opinions, now all of a sudden, speak up and start to organize and get involved and say, hey, I've sat by the sidelines too long and now I want to do something about it. And so, that point is well taken. In terms of your future plans, what direction do you think you're going in? And is there a lot of pressure in law school to go the corporate route? I mean, again, doing this as a public service is not necessarily the most lucrative legal opportunity out there. What are the ways that you think you can apply your training into the social justice field? And it's not always taking the bar and going to court, right?
Right. Interestingly enough, we were talking about this for a good amount of time before we congregated here. I think law school is such a mentally exhausting, and it's financially challenging. It costs a lot of money to go to law school, that I guess to a certain extent I understand the pressure to go, the big law firm route. And it's harder to pursue a career in which you're going to be doing public interest lawyering, either as a legal aid lawyer or as a public defender, because you might not have the opportunity or the financial remuneration to pay off your loans. But as far as my future is concerned, I think I'd like to do... I've been, considering a number of career paths, but each one of them involves public interest lawyering, either as a legal aid lawyer or someone who works as a public defender, maybe someone who does a combination of both criminal defense as well as civil rights litigation. A lot of those cases have a lot of overlap. That's where I'd like to see myself in a few years.
I know for me, being heading into my last semester right now, it's a little bit of an unknown for me, but what I do know is that I my biggest passion is to help right the wrongs of people who I feel have been wronged, especially when they've been put in a position where they've been taken advantage of. So, you know, it's kind of crazy for me who I'm the person who I wanted to be like that sort of like progressive prosecutor to make that thing happen, and then to see, you know, Larry Krasner take office officially yesterday, especially knowing that, you know, this is not like his rhetoric to me is the direction where I think criminal justice reform needs to go, but then the rest of the system is lagging behind. So whatever I can to help make that process easier, and then also connect, I think, with other activists. I will admit that I think I'm a little bit newer to the activism scene. Currently, I'm trying to, you know, physically get out there, which is why, you know, there are different conferences that other law schools have. I know we were talking about the Reb Law conference that happens at Yale, and I think there's a group of us trying to get something similar together in Philadelphia, in between all the different area law schools, because, you know, we're all here. Mm-hmm. There's quite literally, it's 4 or 5 law schools, right? And that's people who you're connecting, and those people stay organized, stay focused on the active goal at the end of the day. So whether that takes me to become a prosecutor or to become like, I don't even know, whatever it takes that I can do so that I can keep doing this work, then I'll do it.
It seems like you have a concern or even an interest in maybe like dealing with mass incarceration, mm-hmm. especially as it affects people of color here in Philadelphia. Can we talk about that for a second?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because I think that, you know, that's sort of the elephant in the room, right? Mm-hmm. We have civil liberties and all these other rights too, but everything is lost when you are behind bars. And, you know, there's a lot of activism around the school to prison pipeline. In fact, across the street, you know, there's graffiti written on the school that says fire to all the prisons. And so, you know, we sat and reflected on that yesterday. Like, what does it mean, you know? And so I guess I asked that question to you, you know, what can be done? And when you talk about reforms in criminal justice, what specifically are we talking about here? And are you on board with some of the things that people like Larry Krasner are proposing?
Can I answer that one first?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that kind of, I think there's obviously a lot of things we can say, like this law needs to change, this type of prosecuting needs to change, we need to get more money into our public defenders or whatever it is, more resources. But I think one thing that's helped me a lot, I definitely want to be a public defender when I graduate, but is to kind of recognize how trauma affects people in our criminal justice system. So it's so easy to look at a victim of rape or the victim's family of a homicide, and to say those people have gone through trauma and they deserve justice. But when we're looking at really achieving justice, not like criminal justice, but like perfect justice, I think we need to understand that the offender oftentimes has gone through trauma, him or herself, and that in order to really achieve justice, we need to have a system that is trauma informed. And so that's something I've been learning a lot about this past year and semester specifically. And just as a little plug, we are doing a conference here in Philly, and the working title is Liberty and Justice Moving from Some to All, I believe. But we're still working on that title. But Larry Krasner is our keynote, and we just found out that we have 5 breakout sessions, all of which are CLE credit approved. And one of those topics we're going to be talking about trauma-informed justice, crimmigration, women in the law, civil liberties, and how to start a nonprofit. But anyway, so to answer your question specifically, I think that a lot of the wrongs in our system is that we just throw people away rather than looking at this person as a victim of our systems or a victim of some horrible crime that they probably are a victim of. Like the same day they're offender, the same day they're a victim oftentimes. And we need to recognize that, and rather than just seeing them as the person who committed a crime that took them 5 minutes to commit and then throwing them away for the rest of their life.
Yeah, and there's a large number of people incarcerated for nonviolent drug offenses, for example. And the majority of those never go to trial. People take deals. And so one could argue that because they don't have good legal representation or enough support or, the information they need to make a good decision, that a lot of times people accept these deals that are, even though they might have, quote unquote, committed a crime, these deals are bad deals, and they're sent to prison and then experience more trauma in the prisons, through lack of communication, poor conditions, no education, and then that leads to the recidivism rate being high.
Exactly.
Right.
We were just talking about this before, the problem of how prevalent plea bargaining is as a means to resolve cases. The Atlantic recently did a piece that shows the bind that people are placed in when they have to choose between plea bargaining and going to trial. I don't remember the facts of the case specifically, but there was a woman who I believe was in New Jersey, and she had a boyfriend staying over, and the boyfriend had left some marijuana at her home. And she was eventually arrested for it, and she now has to face the choice between going into a plea bargain or going to trial to try to prove to the prosecutor and to the judge that, the marijuana wasn't hers and that she's completely innocent of this crime. One of the unfortunate aspects of our criminal justice system is that it costs a lot of resources in order to go through trial. Not only financial resources, but mental resources. I mean, it takes a psychological and mental toll to be able to navigate your way through the criminal justice system. So you're faced with this horrible choice between getting a plea bargain in which you're going to get a lighter sentence or possibly no sentence at all, but have some sort of penalty slapped on you, as opposed to going to trial. And if you do go to trial, and if you are someone who comes from a low-income background and might not have the access to a criminal defense lawyer, or you'll have to face a situation where you're with a public defender who might be overworked, those are two options that are not the best of options. So plea bargaining forces you to essentially confess to something that you didn't even do. But as far as the plea bargaining problem is concerned, I was talking to Cassie about this, I really don't know what the solution to that problem is. One of the reasons plea bargaining is so prevalent, and I don't say this as a defense of the system, but courts are so overloaded and the case files just stack up so high that there's a huge incentive for prosecutors and judges to try to resolve cases through plea bargaining. I think somewhere between 90 to 95% of criminal cases are resolved through plea bargaining. What the alternative is, I don't know. I wish there was a solution, but hopefully I have 3 more semesters left at law school, so 3 more semesters to think about it. But if any of you have any solutions, I'd be more than willing to hear about it.
When the district attorney, I believe it was Seth Williams, several years ago, first started Project SAM, which was early form of marijuana decriminalization. It wasn't inspired by justice or medicinal uses, but rather for the purpose that you stated, because they wanted to alleviate the burden of public defenders and free up resources. And they felt as though if they didn't have to try people or plea bargain them for having small amounts of marijuana, that this would free up more resources. And then later on, the decriminalization law came, and so now they don't have to prosecute the majority of those cases. So I think a change in drug policy.
Absolutely.
And in states like California, which just legalized marijuana, which also has expungement of criminal records and equity programs for people, as you said, traumatized and affected by the drug war. I think at least in that area of the legal system, there are some solutions. For other things, though, you know, theft, rape, murder, I mean, hard to tell.
Right. I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with you. I mean, if there was a total decriminalization of marijuana, this person whose story I'd mentioned wouldn't be in that bind in the first place, where she has to choose or make the unfortunate choice between pleading guilty to something she didn't even do and going to trial to try to prove her innocence and spend a lot of financial and mental resources to achieve that end. So definitely some sort of decriminalization would have to come into effect in order to alleviate the problem of plea bargaining. So thank you for that.
I guess it'd be interesting to study, right? You know, in the states that have changed their laws in that matter, you know, has it actually resulted in freeing up resources for prosecutors, you know, and has that resulted in less plea bargains? So if you're looking for an idea for a paper.
Yes. And I think California would be a good state to follow, because I think they just recently, decriminalized marijuana there.
Right.
They legalized for recreational adult use.
Legalized for.
Yes.
And I think to add to that, like to go off of what you're saying, is whatever we do with, in terms of like small possession, especially for marijuana, it needs to be across the board, because I know that in Philadelphia, I think it's like a fine that you have to pay, but I know in the county still you can get hit. It, like for some places it's still a crime. You can still get arrested for it, and you can end up, like, say you're 18 years old, 19, 20, 21, you can end up really losing your financial aid. So as a result of you potentially taking this plea bargain, if you don't have the funds or the resources to have private counsel, that could really put you on the path back into the school to prison pipeline, ultimately, over literally maybe an ounce of weed.
Yeah, totally. And then the other thing that we know in Philadelphia is that when plea bargaining, people often go through a drug treatment program that's funded by the county of Philadelphia, and then a big chunk of those resources, because we're also dealing with the opioid epidemic, go to people who are being arrested for possession, who are then now forced to go through drug treatment programs and money that could be going to other people. And so Chris Goldstein, who's a frequent contributor here, he's written a lot about that, freeing up the resources and where the money goes. But Siobhan, I wanted to ask you, because earlier you talked about, I think that with this new Krasner administration, that there is going to be some reform, and that's the direction that it should go in. Can you elaborate more on that and maybe talk more about some of the things that he's been advocating?
So I, in terms of myself, I think one of the things that I learned during my time in law school is, I know plenty of people who say, well, the criminal justice system is broken. It needs to be fixed. It needs to be, we need to be doing some sort of reform. And we do need to be doing some sort of reform. But I think what's more telling, and I think what's more of a statement that really resonated with me, was hearing, well, the fact of the matter is the criminal justice system right now is doing exactly what it has always intended. Like, it is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. It is criminalizing people, oftentimes who don't have power or resources or privilege, and it's criminalizing people who, for the most part, a lot of people would turn a blind eye to. So, for me to see Larry Krasner's, election, and to see him go through and make those talking points of, we were just having a discussion about how he wants to get rid of the death penalty entirely, which I fully wholeheartedly agree with, and it's something that you have to prepare yourself mentally if you do want to be a prosecutor and you are in a state where the death penalty exists, because you're potentially putting that person away and then terminating a life completely. So regardless of how you feel, that's still something that is a finite decision. So to see him implicating something like that, where I was, studying death penalty for a semester, and you learn about how basically depending on what age you are, if you're too young, they think you can't be reformed, so you can't be let out. If you're too old, they think that you can't, there's nothing else you can do because you've already had all these violent tendencies. So I think the other thing that Larry Krasner is doing, and Waqar, feel free to comment on this, but he's changing the rhetoric and he's changing the narrative. I think there's this oversimplification that allows the criminal justice system to do what it's doing. It's this idea of there are criminals in the world and those criminals need to be put in jail, when in reality, for the most part, those criminals, quote unquote, are people who tend to make mistakes, or who are kids who tend to make mistakes because they're kids. And as a result, they end up in a system where they're over-policed and then they're punished, and then they lose access to things that ultimately they can't even put themselves on the right path. So what really reform are we doing? Or like we're saying, you do the time and then you can go out and be a better person. But when you literally can't get aid to get an education after, you've been convicted, or after, you have this criminal record, what exactly are you supposed to do? And that's why I say to have somebody like Larry Krasner being elected, being at the forefront, really, and vaulting Philadelphia into the national news to say that this is a possible thing and that we can do this, I think it puts not just a pressure on other criminal justice systems throughout the country and other DA's offices, it also puts the onus on us as people who are law students and people who want to go into criminal law, or, to become criminal lawyers, whether you want to be a public defender or you want to be a prosecutor. It puts the onus on us that we need to own up that this happens.
Well, hold that thought. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll talk more with Waqar Sherban and Cassie, who are law students at Drexel and Villanova University. We've been having a conversation with them here on the People Power Lunch Hour show, and when we come back, we'll talk more with them about criminal justice reform, the immigration policies proposed by this administration, and also local organizing here in Philadelphia. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. You're listening to Philly Cam, WPPM, and Philly Cam TV. Hey, welcome back to the People Power Lunch Hour Show. I'm your host, Vanessa Maria Graber, and you're tuned into WPPM 106.5 FM. And if you're watching us on PhillyCam TV on Comcast and Verizon. So on today's show, I've been talking with 3 law students who go to Villanova Law School and Drexel. And they've been talking about social justice and how our legal system and our, mass incarceration all affects social justice here in Philadelphia. So before the break, we were talking with Siobhan, who is speaking specifically about some of the things that Larry Krasner was proposing in his new administration, such as an elimination of the death penalty. So I wanted to go to Waqar, who I think had some thoughts about that.
Sure. Firstly, I agree with everything that Siobhan had said. 2 other additional points I wanted to make as far as the impact that Larry Krasner has had. One is that his election has been has made an informative point, not only to the people of Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, but to the entire nation, and has opened our eyes to the fact that DAs are elected. And as politically informed as I try to be, I actually did not know that up until, very recently, that we have the power to elect our prosecutors. And if we are as serious as we say we are about criminal justice reform, then we need to know that it is within our power. We all have the power to vote. Not all of us have the power to vote. And that's another issue that we should probably get into. But those who do have the privilege of voting can exercise that privilege in order to put in a progressive DA who will exercise prosecutorial discretion in a way that's smarter, and in a way that's more just, and in a way that just doesn't seek to lock up as many people as possible. There's been an era that's been too long where prosecutors have been just racking up a scorecard of how many prosecutions they can secure and how many people they can lock up. And I think Larry Krasner, his election will bring a sea change to that. The other thing that I think is important about his election is that he is someone who has recognized the role that other institutions play in criminal justice. I don't think I've ever heard of a prosecutor talk as much about schools and social workers and treatment centers as much as he has. It's not something that he has direct control over, but just given the fact that he recognizes that we need to work on our schools and we need to work on other institutions that are not, a part of the criminal justice system itself, but are sort of tangential to it and maybe even criminal justice adjacent, improving those institutions will have the effect of bringing about better criminal justice systems. So to have a DA who will work with some of our local council people on improving schools and improving other institutions, I think will go a long way towards seeing a reduction in mass incarceration.
Cassie, how do you think eliminating the death penalty or eliminating cash bail systems will affect people, especially the people you plan on defending in the future?
I mean, I think it would be great for them. I'm very against the death penalty. It was Brian, we were talking today, Waqar and I were talking about Brian Stevenson. He's the founder of Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. And how he says that it's not that whether or not you believe that they deserve to die, it's whether we deserve to kill them. And are we willing to do the thing that we have just said was so horrible that they deserve death for it? And so that's just my perspective on the death penalty. But I think to some of the things that Waqar was saying about Larry Krasner's view on some of the institutions, like education, I think that, and it actually answers a question you asked us earlier about whether or not the legal career is the best way to create social change. And I think that for me, it's what I'm supposed to do, I believe. But I think that there's so much power in social workers and caseworkers, in teachers. Like, I think teaching is probably, in my mind, like one of the most important jobs you can have. And so I think that just that there's a million ways that you can create social change, and that the legal career is going to put a lot of limits on you. But there are ways, of course, to create social change as a lawyer as well. But yeah, so it's exciting that we have a DA who's now recognizing that our criminal justice system is meeting people at a point, like being a public defender is really a Band-Aid in that situation for that person, and that we need to look at, the fact that in West Philly, our students are drinking brown water, and that we just don't have we're not putting resources into education and into our cities and into policing. Like, we're putting too much money into policing. We're not recognizing that how our institutions often bring people to the point where they're going to need a public defender, or to where they're involved in the criminal justice system. So that's exciting.
Yeah, and I believe I think it was Pennsylvania is one of the states that had private prisons sue them because there wasn't enough people in the prisons, to keep their contracts going. Mm-hmm. So it could explain, again, a couple things, like unnecessary resources going into funding these things where there's not a real need, and over policing and people with scorecards on who they put away, because it's, ultimately related to for-profit contracts that are out mm-hmm. there. So I just want to switch gears a little bit and talk about something that we've talked about a couple times on this show, but I believe we should keep talking about it. And that's because Philadelphia has a large undocumented population, an immigrant population, and a very rich, beautiful, multicultural city. And yet there are a lot of people at risk, and ICE has come through very recently and rounded up over 100 people and sent them to detention centers. Waqar, I wanted to ask you about your thoughts around the organizing on this, issue, not just the travel ban, but immigration as a whole, and how you feel, what changes should be made.
As far as changes should be made are concerned, I think one thing that we have seen in the wake of the travel ban that Trump has unfortunately successfully implemented is more and more people on the ground protesting against the policies of ICE just overreaching into communities and arresting people. And one of the encouraging things from 2017, when Trump first tried to implement his Muslim ban, is that we saw scores and scores of people just gathering at the airports and protesting. And that was a boon to the legal work that the lawyers were doing in order to try to lift some of the restrictions of the travel ban. So I think seeing more and more organizing would definitely bring about the changes that we need to see.
Yes, well, definitely. There's a lot of people working on that, including the ACLU. Mm-hmm. You spent some time there. What was your time like at the ACLU, and how do you feel like organizations like that contribute to social justice?
Okay. So the ACLU has a long-standing tradition of representing Americans and even people who are not Americans whose civil liberties have been violated. I think that helping the ACLU by contributing to them financially, you can even volunteer some of your time at the ACLU by fielding some of their intake calls. I was an extern there for a semester, this past semester, and I was working with the staff attorneys there on research and writing to try to advocate for some of the clients that they've been representing recently.
Another issue that is going to be taking place in the courts is the issue of net neutrality. Something, again, a lot of people here are involved in the organizing for. And folks have asked me several times, what can we do? What's going to happen? And I said to them, this is an issue that's going to go to the courts. This is where our activist lawyer friends step up to the plate, and we pass the baton on to them. And so once the rules are published to the Federal Registry, there will be many lawsuits that will be filed by organizations like Free Press, by different states, and many other nonprofit organizations. What are your thoughts on the net neutrality issue as being students who probably heavily rely on the internet for research, for your work, for social media?
I don't even know where I could begin on this, even if I wanted to. I know that this is a conversation that I have had, not just with my parents, but with my peers as well. To me, let's look at the history of net neutrality to begin with. So the reason why these rules came into place was to avoid different companies being able to block your access. And it sounds a lot simpler than it actually is. So it's not just this cutesy little idea of, oh, well, I can live without Facebook and it'll be fine by me. This is also about, all right, well, when the majority of your job search happens on, normally websites now, you can't just give to like a brick and mortar thing. 99.9% of your job applications are now handed through the internet. Almost all education is now done with some sort of internet access at home, which is a whole other issue considering that there are many kids who don't have access to the internet who need it to be able to complete their homework, right? And then it can even go as far as different ISPs and companies being able to block access. And the thing is, you would never be able to know. So you would have all these court cases that would go through. And ultimately, if you couldn't really have the proof, or if you didn't really know what you were searching for, because there's a lot of, very technical computer terms that you have to be able to ask for when you're going through these lawsuits and going through discovery and making your questions for your interrogatories, you couldn't prove your case. So the regulations were originally there, so then that way it's saying, you have access to a free and open internet. And one of the things that I noticed is that the internet has now become kind of the new base for activists to be able to connect with each other as quickly as possible and sometimes as discreetly as possible in order to organize protests without the fear of potentially being over-policed or arrested before they can even make it to where they're going to have their protests. So to see this sort of deregulation, especially when you have so many people rely on it now, especially in this new generation, in the Me Too movement, in the ability to report news, that to me is horrific. I mean, one of the things that I remember, I watched the entirety of the FCC vote. And one of the things that got brought up was, when the events that were happening in Ferguson were happening, no major news sources were reporting it. The only reason, one of the biggest reasons that Ferguson's story got out was because you had these activists and these people on the ground and these local news sources who had the internet and who had the ability to make things go viral. So not only are you just restricting access, you're also being restricted on what you see. And I think I come from a space where, I believe you can love your country, but also in loving your country, you need to be able to critique it. That is something that we need to be able to look at and go, is this really a good idea? And to me, it's just not. To me, it's horrific.
And so many instances of police abuse have only come to light over the past decade or so because citizens have phones through which they can record
Absolutely.
these incidents.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And also those rights to record being upheld.
Absolutely.
Right. Because that's even
Absolutely.
happened here in Philadelphia, where a judge issued a ruling about people not being able to record if they didn't properly identify themselves. And even that is in another legal challenge.
Mm-hmm.
So we only have a few minutes left. I wanted to give you an opportunity to plug your conference again. If there's other students out there or other legal minds who are interested in participating, can you tell them a little bit more about the conference one more time?
Yeah, of course. And Wakar, just jump in. So the working title is Liberty and Justice, Moving from Some to All. And it's a social justice conference open to everyone. But really the planners have been just a group of law students from surrounding law schools. And our keynote is Larry Krasner. And as I mentioned before, the breakout sessions that we're going to have will be on crimmigration, trauma-informed justice, women in the law, how to start a nonprofit, and then civil liberties.
Civil rights litigation.
Civil rights litigation. Sorry about that. And
No problem.
And they're going to they have been approved for CLE credits, which is continuing legal education. So that means hopefully we'll attract a lot of attorneys who are already working. And just the goal is to talk about social justice here in Philly and like the surrounding area, and talking about where we need to improve, what people are doing now. What else would you add?
Just to go back to the goal of the conference. So we have our founding documents that say that, we are securing liberty for and justice for all. But as is evident over the discussion we've had over the past hour, that has not manifested in reality. And right now there is liberty and justice for some. And who are those some? It's, for the general part, it's people who have access to legal resources. It's the rich, it's the powerful. There's a two-tier justice system in this country where you can sort of, quote unquote, buy justice if you have the means to do so. And if you do not have the means to do so, you cannot buy justice, quote unquote. So we want the focus of this conference to be on that deficiency between what our founding documents say and what the reality is. That's why we're talking about moving from some to all, so that we can actually bring about a country in which all people have access to justice. Each one of the students working on the conference is going to be focusing on a different session that's going to be taking place throughout the day. I'm going to be focusing on the Civil Rights Litigation Conference, which will focus on Section 1983 litigation, which is the main federal remedy through which citizens whose civil liberties have been violated can seek relief for their violation. We have one confirmed speaker for that panel so far, David Rudovsky, who's a civil rights legend in the Philadelphia area and is an expert on such matters. And it'll be taking place on February 9th. And it'll be an all-day conference, and we're hoping that law students and lawyers and others can join us on that day.
Is there an email that somebody can contact if they wanted more information?
Yeah. Do you want my email? Or I can look up Liz's.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Okay, Liz is like our leader. It's going to be held at I'm looking this up. It's going to be held at the Trial Advocacy Center, the Thomas R. Klein Trial Advocacy Center, on 12th and Chestnut. So it's local. And then, so Liz Schultz, it's Elizabeth Schultz. So it's ELIZABETH Schultz, SCHULTZ @temple.edu. And I know she wouldn't mind me sharing that. But yeah, we'll definitely be advertising it more. So look out for February 9th at the Trial Ad Center on 12th and Chestnut.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Cassie Grange, Wakar Rahman, Shaban Harding, for joining the People Power Lunch Hour show. I'm your host, Vanessa Maria Graber. We'll be back next week with an all-new episode. Wish you the best of luck in all of your future legal pursuits.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
It was a pleasure speaking with you. If you'd like to be a guest on the People Power Lunch Hour, or you'd like to watch all of our episodes, you can find more information about what we do here at PhillyCam. We'll see you next week. Thanks for listening and watching. You're listening to WPPM LP in Philadelphia. Stay tuned for Sprouts up next.